If a taxi ever pulls up to you in the rain when your phone is dead and there's no one else around, look at the driver's feet before you get in. I didn't. And what I saw later that night is the reason I still flinch every time I see yellow headlights in the. My name is Emily, and what happened to me 2 years ago still doesn't fully make sense, no matter how many times I've gone over it in my head, lying awake at replaying every second. I was working the closing shift at a bar called The Anchor, the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox that only played songs from the 90s. It was the end of October, and the rain had started suddenly, the way it does sometimes, that heavy drops hammering the pavement until the whole street looked like a sheet of black glass rippling with the reflections of streetlights and neon signs. I stood under the awning, wrapping my thin jacket tighter around myself, the kind of jacket that looks fine in a store but does absolutely nothing against the cold, wet wind that cuts straight through. God, I'm an idiot, I remember thinking. I saw the forecast this morning. I knew it was going to rain. The last customers had stumbled out half an hour earlier, leaving behind the smell of spilled beer, cigarette, and cheap cologne. I'd wiped down the tables, stacked the chairs, counted the register under the tired eye of Mike, the bartender who'd been working there longer than I'd been alive. Now that the work was done, the exhaustion hit me all at once. That particular kind of heavy, dragging tiredness that builds up after a 12-hour shift on your feet. Go on, get out of here, Mike said, locking the door behind us. Your guy's picking you up, right? Look at this rain. He was supposed to, I mumbled, instinctively reaching for my phone. The screen stayed black no matter how many times I pressed the button. Damn it. Right. The battery had died sometime after lunch, and between the rush of orders and the chaos of closing, I'd completely forgotten to charge it, and now here I was, no way to call, no way to order a cab through the app. The message from Jake had come in earlier that afternoon, back when my phone still had some life left in it. Got pulled into an emergency work trip. 3 days, can't picture you up tonight. Order a cab, I'll send money. Love you. Sweet words, but they weren't doing much to comfort me right now. It was almost midnight, pouring rain, an empty street on the edge of town. A good 40-minute doctor home. The buses ran once an hour. If they ran at all this late, I sighed, pulled my collar up, and stepped out from under the awning. The cold rain immediately went to work on my body, soaking my hair, running down the back of my neck. I started walking toward the street was deserted, just the occasional car splashing by, throwing up dirty spray from the gutter. And then, like some kind of answer to a prayer I hadn't even said out loud, a yellow shape appeared in the distance. The car moved slowly, almost lazily, like it was searching for someone. On the roof, a rectangular sign glowed with unevenly lit red letters. Relief washed over me in a wave. Without thinking twice, I threw up my hand and stepped to the edge of the road. The headlights blinded me for a second, but the car rolled smoothly to a stop, its old wipers squeaking across the windshield. The door opened with a dot. Evening, sweetheart. Get in before you drown out there. Where to? The voice came from inside, rough with a faint accent I couldn't quite place. I climbed in without hesitation and slammed the door shut behind me. The inside of the car hit me with warm, stale air, thick with the smell of old tobacco smoke, sweat, and something else underneath, Swedish and musty like the basement of an old house. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that it was warm. It was dry, and this beat up old car was going to get me home. Wow, wow. Some weather we're having tonight, I said, settling into the seat. Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver, I added, meaning it. 45 Builder Street, third entrance. Please, I told him. The driver nodded and shifted gears. The car, an old yellow Sid and the color of an egg yolk, eased forward. In the glow of the dashboard lights, I got my first real look at him. A stocky, broad man somewhere in his 50s with thick black hair and a matching mustache. Gray creeping in at the temples, heavy rings glinted on his thick fingers. When he turned to glance back at me, gold caps flashed on a couple of his smile was wide, almost welcoming. Don't see many people out walking in weather like this, he said, eyes back on the road. You work around here? Yeah, at a bar, I answered shortly, trying not to breathe too deeply. The smell in the car was thick. It wrapped around me like a second skin. The driver shook his head. Tough work. People get drunk, get hands wide. I bet. Sometimes, I said. I looked out the window at the familiar streets sliding past. The rain outside turned the world into a smeared watercolor painting. Streetlights stretched into long yellow streaks, shop windows blurred into smudges of color. Don't you worry, sweetheart. I'll get you there fast, he said, flashing another grin in the rear view mirror. The car turned off the main road toward my neighborhood, but for some reason it took an unfamiliar route, cutting through dark side streets and back alleys instead. I felt the first flicker of unease almost immediately. I think this isn't the way, I said. Construction up ahead, traffic jam this time of night, the driver said with an easy wave of his hand. I know a shortcut. Don't worry about it. I nodded, but somewhere deep, a knot of nervousness stirred and wouldn't settle. A couple of minutes passed before I managed to get a grip on myself. Tiredness, nerves, the dark outside, all of it playing tricks on my imagination, I told myself. I looked out the window again. The houses seemed to lose their sharp edges, the outlines blurring like I was looking at them through murky water or fogged up glass. A grocery store I knew well, the one on the corner, seemed to shimmer with a strange haze. Cold back there, sweetheart. I can turn up the heat. No, I'm fine, I answered, feeling a chill crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I stole a glance at him. He sat there, swaying slightly with the motion of the car. His thick fingers drummed against the steering wheel. And then suddenly he stopped talking, not just paused, but went completely, totally silent. Even the sound of his breathing disappeared. A silence settled over the car so deep it rang in my ears. Just the howl of the wind outside and the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Without thinking, I lifted my eyes to the rear view mirror and froze. In the darkness of the back seat, I could see shapes, vague, blurred, like shadows cast by a flickering flame. They sat motionless, staring straight ahead, but I could feel the weight of their eyes on me. Icy terror locked up my whole body. I forced myself to turn my head. The back seat was empty, just my bag sitting there, exactly where I'd left it. My heart slammed against my ribs. I looked back at the mirror. They were still there, the same shapes, clearer now, like someone was sitting very close to me, almost touching. But in reality, there was nothing there. One of the shapes had an neck twisted at and another seemed to be crying. A third one just stared straight at me out of the mirror, and where its eyes should have been, there was nothing but empty space. Comfortable back there? The driver suddenly asked. His voice came out so close it sounded like he'd leaned right up against my ear. I flinched, jerking toward the door. What, yeah, yeah? I'm fine. He smiled again in the mirror. The gold teeth looked less like a smile and more like a snarl. We'll be there soon, but we weren't getting there. The minutes stretched on, somehow turning into what felt like hours. The road outside had lost all its landmarks. Buildings flickered past, but they weren't the buildings of my city. These were grim, gray structures with empty eye-socket windows and crooked roofs disappearing into a low leaden sky. Sometimes there were figures standing on the side of the road, motionless, turned toward the car, and it felt like they were watching it pass with eyes I couldn't see but could feel against my skin. Where are we? My voice came out thin and unfamiliar, barely my own. On the road, sweetheart. Where else? The doctor answered. He wasn't looking at the mirror anymore. He was staring straight ahead, and his face had gone stony rigid, stripped of that earlier crooked friendliness. I want to get out. I want to get out. Please stop the car. Can't stop here, sweetheart. Not safe to stop here. Lots of angry people out at night. Dangerous for a girl walking alone. There wasn't a trace of his earlier flattery in his voice now. Just a cold iron statement of fact, and that smile, that same golden smile, was still frozen on his face, but now it looked painted on, like a mask. Stop the car right now, I screamed, grabbing for the door handle. It wouldn't budge, like it had been welded shut. The driver slowly turned his head toward me, not his whole body, just his head. It was tilted at an impossible angle. His neck cracked loudly, like dry branches snapping. The sound echoed through my skull and made me shrink back into the seat instantly. Now shut up and sit still, he said, and there wasn't a single trace of his earlier warmth left in his voice. We'll be there soon. I pulled back, pressing my spine against the door. Panic, sharp and uncontrollable, climbed up my throat. Not knowing how else to react, I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to pull myself together. Okay, Emily, breathe. Just breathe. This is a nightmare. This is just exhaustion playing tricks on you, I told myself. But the cold of the seat soaking through my thin dress and coat, the smell of all of it was horrifyingly real. This wasn't just a kidnapping, this was something else. Something unnatural. I looked at the driver, at his thick hands resting on the wheel, and then my gaze slid downward. I saw his legs, or rather, what was where his legs should have been. Where there should have been feet in cheap sneakers or boots, there was something elk, covered in short, bristly fur. And where there should have been feet, there were hard, black, cloven hooves. They pressed against the pedals. And every time he applied pressure, instead of a metallic click, there came a faint, hollow, bony thud. I blinked hard and looked again. Maybe I was imagining it, but no. The reality was cruel. Oh my god, that's an actual hoof. The whole world seemed to flip in that moment, collapsing into a single point of freezing terror. All the strangeness, the blurred city, the shapes in the mirror, the endless road, it all clicked together into one monstrous picture. This wasn't a taxi. This was a trap. I wasn't in a car with some strange driver. I was in a cage with something else entirely. An icy fist of realization slammed into my chest, knocking the air out of me. My mind kept circling back to those enormous goat-like hooves. an image straight out of nightmares and old folk tales. Stories my grandmother used to tell about something that wanders the edges of the world. A taxi to nowhere. A taxi that picks up the people who've completely let their guard down and carries them until it wears them down completely. So that's what those shapes in the mirror were. Probably the souls of all the people it had worn down to nothing. And then, in a flash, words rose up in my memory, bright and sudden, my grandmother's voice, quiet but so clear, exactly as I remembered it from childhood. My grandmother, who grew up in a small village out in the countryside, who knew every superstition, every charm, every story about the things that walk this world alongside people, used to sit with me at the kitchen table over evening tea and tell me, "Remember this, sweetheart. The old spirits, they're dangerous. But sometimes they're foolish too. They live outside our time. If one comes after you, if it won't let go, tell it come back yesterday. It throws them completely off balance. They can't stand that kind of confusion. They run from it, confused, like they don't know which way is up." Back then, at 10 years old, I'd laughed, picturing some shaggy demon scratching its head in bewilderment. "What do you mean? Yesterday?" Now those words were the only lifeline I had in a churning, freezing sea of hopelessness. The car was tearing down a road that was now completely and straight as an arrow, vanishing into pitch black nothing. On either side stretched a dead barren field, scattered with twisted bare trees that looked more like the skeletons of giants. The driver spoke again, and his voice had returned to something almost human, almost like before. But now there was a sticky, sickly sweetness underneath it. "You like riding with me, sweetheart? We could see each other sometimes, you know. I could take you anywhere you want, somewhere beautiful. What do you say, Hans? Nice." And then he turned around, really turned around, his spine cracking horribly as he did, his neck stretched, becoming unnaturally long, thick veins bulging along it. His grin, like something out of a fever dream, stretched unnaturally wide, all the way to his ears, bearing rows of teeth that weren't gold caps anymore but small, sharp, yellow fangs like a fish's. And his face, it was changing too. The skin had gone to smooth to white, stretched tight like parchment. His eyes, small, deep set, glowed with a dim yellow light like the eyes of some nocturnal predator. Everything in front of me started to swim, and nausea arose in my throat. This was my last chance to pull myself together. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. The sharp, real pain helped me scrape together the last of my willpower. I straightened those yellow eyes and said clearly, separating each word the way my grandmother had taught me, "Come back yesterday." The sly grin slid off the driver's face like a mask falling away. His features twisted with something between disbelief. He jerked his head sharply, and that cracking sound came again. "What?" I felt my cheeks burn with a sudden rush of adrenaline. A moment later, I repeated it louder, steadier. "Come back yesterday." The driver's face contorted. It kept changing, losing whatever was left of its human features. The skin darkened, splitting into wrinkled cracks. His mustache shriveled into tufts of, and his eyes flared up with a hellish crimson fire. A roar tore out of him in hue, full of such wild fury that the windows of the car rattled. The old sedan's engine screamed, and it lurched forward with such force I was thrown back against the seat. The world outside the window dissolved into a smeared streak of darkness. The car was thrown side to side, hurtling down a road that now twisted and drifted like it was slipping into some unknown alien dimension. The smell of sulfur and smoke filled the cabin. The shadows in the back seat stirred, agitated, stretching shapeless limbs toward me, but they seemed afraid to get. The driver, barely recognizable as anything human anymore, sat hunched over the wheel, his long, bony fingers tipped with filthy claws gripping it tight. He muttered something under his breath, grinding his teeth, and in that muttering I could hear curses in a language that shouldn't exist. I pressed myself into the seat, repeating it over and over like a mantra. Come back yesterday. Come back. I was terrified that if I stopped, I'd lose that fragile barrier of protection. And then suddenly, a sharp, piercing screech of brakes spun the car in place. The seatbelt I hadn't even noticed I was wearing slammed me back against the seat with bruising force. Silence. We were sitting at the exact same bus stop where I'd gotten in. The rain was still drizzling down, lit by the same street lamp. The familiar sign for the anchor glowed about 20 yards away. The passenger door clicked open with a dull sound. I didn't think after that. Pure survival instinct threw me out of the current onto the wet pavement. I didn't look back. I didn't check my bag. I just ran. Ran like I'd never run in my life, feeling the cold air, my heart slamming so hard I thought it would burst right out of my chest. I only dared to look back after I'd gone 100 yards or so, tripping over a curb, nearly falling. The street was empty, no yellow sedan, no tire tracks on the wet asphalt, just the rain, quietly drumming on the rooftops, and one lonely dog huddled deeper into a doorway. I stumbled home on shaking legs, my keys rattling so badly in my hands that it took 3 tries to get them into the lock. Once inside, I locked every bolt on the door, hooked the chain, dragged a heavy chair in front of it for good measure, then switched on every light I could find and curled up in the corner of the couch, pulling a blanket over my head. My whole body shook with fine, constant tremors that didn't stop until morning. I didn't sleep, listening to every creak in the apartment, every groan of the floorboards, every hum of water in the pipes. I kept thinking that any second now, a flash of yellow would appear outside the window in the dark and a red neon sign would flicker on, spelling out TR is not. But nothing happened. By morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the skies of the shaking gradually eased. I went to the window. The street was alive with its normal rhythm, cars driving by, people hurrying off to work. The world was sharp and real again. Jake came home 3 days later. I couldn't hold it, threw myself at him, sobbing, telling him this rambling, incoherent story about a taxi, the rain, and hooves. He listened, stroked my hair, told me it was probably just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. He convinced me to see a doctor, to take something mild to help me calm down. Slowly, the vividness of the memory began to fade. I tried with everything I had to convince myself it had all been some kind of breakdown, tried to explain it away with simple, rational reasons. The darkness, the exhaustion, the stress. It didn't happen all at once, but eventually the fear really did start to retreat, giving way to a vertiginous, and then just plain anxiety. I needed that. The constant suspicion was getting in the way of living, choking me like a scratchy, uncomfortable scarf. But to this day, I don't walk alone after dark anymore. And I order cabs very rarely now. and only ever through an app where I can see the driver's name, his photo, his license plate before I ever step outside to meet